Rafiq al-Shabazz had settled such questions to his own satisfaction. I had first met Rafiq while working with some of my leaders on setting up a job training center to serve the South Side's unemployed. He was a slight, wiry man with a goatee and a skullcap that accentuated a pair of prominent ears, a former gangbanger who had formed an organization called the Roseland Unity Coalition. The purported purpose of the organization was black empowerment and economic development. According to Rafiq, the coalition had been critical to helping Mayor Washington get elected. From what my leaders told me, however, Rafiq spent most of his time intimidating local businesses and elected officials into giving them small contracts for, quote, community outreach and other vaguely defined ventures. In fact, it was after we negotiated with the city of Chicago to open up a new job training center in the area that Rafiq called me up and launched into a rapid-fire monologue. "We gotta talk, Barack," he said. "What y'all trying to do with the job training needs to fit into the overall comprehensive development plan I've been working on. Can't think about this thing in isolation. Gotta look at the big picture. You don't understand the forces at work out here. It's big, man. All kinds of folks ready to stab you in the back." I eventually gathered that Rafiq had an interest in having the new training center we just proposed to the city locate in a certain building near his office on Michigan Avenue. I didn't ask the particular nature of that interest. I doubted I could get a straight answer out of him, and anyway, I figured that we might be able to use Rafiq as an ally in what was proving to be a series of sticky negotiations with the city. If the storefront he had in mind met the necessary specifications, I said, then I was willing to propose it as one possible alternative. So Rafiq and I formed an uneasy alliance, one that didn't go over too well with the DCP leaders. I understood their concerns. Whenever we sat down with Rafiq to discuss our joint strategy, he would interrupt the discussion with long lectures about secret machinations afoot, and all the black people willing to sell folks down the river. It was an effective negotiating ploy, for with his voice progressively rising, the veins in his neck straining, leaders like Ruby would suddenly drop into a curious silence, watching Rafiq as if he were an epileptic in the midst of a seizure. More than once, I'd have to jump in and start shouting back at him, not so much in anger as simply to slow him down, until finally a small smile would curl under his mustache, and we could get back to work. When the two of us were alone, though, Rafiq and I could sometimes have normal conversations. Over time, I arrived at a grudging admiration for his tenacity and bravado, and, within his own terms, a certain sincerity. He confirmed that he had been a gang leader growing up in the Altgeld Gardens public housing projects. He had found religion, he said, under the stewardship of a local Muslim leader, unaffiliated with Minister Louis Farrakhan's Nation of Islam. "If it hadn't been for Islam, man, I'd probably be dead," he told me one day. "Just had a negative attitude, you understand? Growing up in Altgeld, I'd soak up all the poison the white man feeds us. See, the folks you're working with got the same problem, even though they don't realize it yet. They spend half their lives worrying about what white folks think. Start blaming themselves for the shit they see every day, thinking they can't do no better till the white man decides they all right. But deep down, they know that ain't right. They know what this country has done to their mama, their daddy, their sister. So the truth is they hate white folk, but they can't admit it to themselves. Keep it all bottled up, fighting themselves. Waste a lot of energy that way. I tell you one thing I admire about white folks," Rafiq continued. "They know who they are. Look at the Italians. They didn't care about the American flag and all that when they got here. First thing they did was put together the mafia to make sure their interests were met. The Irish, they took over the city hall, found their boys some jobs. The Jews, same thing. You telling me they care more about some black kid on the south side than they do about relatives in Israel? Shit. It's about blood, Barack, looking after your own. Period. Black people are the only ones stupid enough to worry about their enemies." That was the truth as Rafiq saw it, and he didn't waste energy picking that truth apart. His was a Hobbesian world where distrust was a given and loyalties extended from family to mosque to the black race, whereupon notions of loyalty ceased to apply. This narrowing vision of blood and tribe had provided Rafiq with a clarity of sorts, a means of focusing his attention. Black self-respect had delivered the mayor's seat, he could argue, just as black self-respect turned around the lives of drug addicts under the tutelage of the Muslims. Progress was within our grasp, so long as we didn't betray ourselves. But what exactly constituted betrayal? Ever since the first time I'd picked up Malcolm X's autobiography, I tried to untangle the twin strands of black nationalism, arguing that nationalism's affirming message of solidarity and self-reliance discipline, and communal responsibility need not depend on hatred of whites, any more than it depended on white munificence. We could tell this country where it was wrong, I would tell myself and any black friends who would listen, without ceasing to believe in its capacity for change. In talking to self-professed nationalists like Rafiq, though, I came to see how the blanket indictment of everything white served a central function in their message of uplift, how psychologically, at least, one depended on the other. For when the nationalist spoke of a reawakening of values as the only solution to black poverty, he was expressing an implicit, if not explicit, criticism to black listeners, that we did not have to live as we did. And while there were those who could take such an unadorned message and use it to hew out a new life for themselves, those with the stolid dispositions that Booker T. Washington had once demanded from his followers, in the ears of many blacks, such talk smacked of the explanations that whites had always offered for black poverty, that we continued to suffer from, if not genetic inferiority, then cultural weakness. It was a message that ignored causality or fault, a message outside history, without a script or plot that might insist on progression. For a people already stripped of their history, a people often ill-equipped to retrieve that history in any form other than what fluttered across the television screen, the testimony of what we saw every day seemed only to confirm our worst suspicions about ourselves. Black nationalism provided that history, an unambiguous morality tale that was easily communicated and easily grasped. A steady attack on the white race, the constant recitation of black people's brutal experience in this country, served as the ballast that could prevent the ideas of personal and communal responsibility from tipping into an ocean of despair. Yes, the nationalists would say, whites are responsible for your sorry state, not any inherent flaws in you. In fact, the nationalists would continue, whites are so heartless and devious that we can no longer expect anything from them. The self-loathing you feel, what keeps you drinking or thieving, is planted by them. Rid them from your mind and find your true power liberated. Rise up, ye mighty race. All this was painful to consider, as painful now as it had been years ago. It contradicted the morality my mother had taught me, a morality of subtle distinctions, between individuals of goodwill and those who wished me ill, between active malice and ignorance or indifference. I had a personal stake in that moral framework. I discovered that I couldn't escape it if I tried. As it turned out, though, it was questions of effectiveness and not sentiment that caused most of my quarrels with Rafiq. Once, after a particularly thorny meeting with the city, I asked Rafiq whether he could turn out his followers if a public showdown with the city became necessary. I don't got time to run around passing out flyers trying to explain everything to the public, Rafiq said. Most of the folks out here don't care one way or another. The ones that do are going to be double-crossing Negroes trying to mess things up. Important thing is to get our plan tight and get the city signed on. That's how stuff gets done, not with a big crowd and noise and all that. Once we get a done deal, then y'all announce it any way you like. I disagreed with Rafiq's approach. For all his professed love of black people, he seemed to distrust them an awful lot. But I also knew his approach was dictated by a lack of capacity. Neither his organization nor his mosque, I had discovered, could claim a membership of more than 50 persons. His influence arose not from any strong organizational support, but from his willingness to show up at every meeting that remotely affected Roseland and shout his opponents into submission. What held true for Rafiq was true throughout the city, without the concentrating effect of Harold Washington's campaign. Nationalism dissipated into an attitude, rather than any concrete program, a collection of grievances and not an organized force. Images and sound that crowded the airwaves in conversation, but without any corporal existence. Among the handful of groups to hoist the nationalist banner, only the Nation of Islam had any significant following. Minister Farrakhan's sharply cadenced sermons generally drew a packed house, and still more listened to his radio broadcasts. But the nation's active membership in Chicago was considerably smaller. Several thousand, perhaps, roughly the size of one of Chicago's biggest black congregations. A base that was rarely, if ever, mobilized around political races or in support of broad-based programs. In fact, the physical presence of the nation in the neighborhoods was nominal, restricted mainly to the clean-cut men in suits and bow ties who stood at the intersections of major thoroughfares selling the nation's newspaper, The Final Call. Questions of competition, decisions forced by a market economy and majoritarian rule, issues of power. It was this unyielding reality, that whites were not simply phantoms to be expunged from our dreams, but were an active and varied fact of our everyday lives, that finally explained how nationalism could thrive as an emotion and flounder as a program. So long as nationalism remained a cathartic curse on the white race, it could win the applause of the jobless teenager listening on the radio or the businessman watching late-night TV. But the descent from such unifying fervor to the practical choices blacks confronted every day was steep. Compromises were everywhere. The black accountant asked, "How am I going to open an account at the black-owned bank if it charges me extra for checking and won't even give me a business loan because it says it can't afford the risk?" The black nurse said, "White folks I work with ain't so bad, and even if they were, I can't be quitting my job. Who's going to pay my rent tomorrow or feed my children today?" Rafiq had no ready answers to such questions. He was less interested in changing the rules of power than in the color of those who had it, and therefore enjoyed its spoils. There was never much room at the top of the pyramid. In a contest framed in such terms, the wait for black deliverance would be long indeed. What in the hands of Malcolm X had once seemed a call to arms, a declaration that we would no longer tolerate the intolerable, came to be the very thing Malcolm had sought to root out. One more feeder of fantasy, one more mask for hypocrisy, one more excuse for inaction. Black politicians less gifted than Harold discovered what white politicians had known for a very long time, that race baiting could make up for a host of limitations. Younger leaders, eager to make a name for themselves, upped the ante, peddling conspiracy theories all over town. The Koreans were funding the Klan, Jewish doctors were injecting black babies with the AIDS virus. It was a shortcut to fame, if not always fortune. Like sex or violence on TV, black rage always found a ready market. Nobody I spoke with in the neighborhood seemed to take such talk very seriously. As it was, many had already given up the hope that politics could actually improve their lives, much less make demands on them. To them, a ballot, if cast at all, was simply a ticket to a good show. Blacks had no real power to act on the occasional slips into anti-Semitism or Asian bashing, people would tell me. And anyway, black folks needed a chance to let off a little steam every once in a while. Man, what do you think those folks say about us behind our backs? Just talk. Yet what concerned me wasn't just the damage loose talk caused our efforts at coalition building, or the emotional pain it caused others. It was the distance between our talk and our action, the effect it was having on us as individuals and as a people. That gap corrupted both language and thought. It made us forgetful and encouraged fabrication. It eventually eroded our ability to hold either ourselves or each other accountable. The continuing struggle to align word and action, our heartfelt desires with a workable plan, didn't self-esteem finally depend on just this? It was that belief which had led me into organizing, and it was that belief which would lead me to conclude, perhaps for the final time, that notions of purity, of race, or of culture could no more serve as the basis for the typical black American self-esteem than it could for mine. Our sense of wholeness would have to arise from something more fine than the bloodlines we inherited. It would have to come from the messy, contradictory details of our own experience. I pulled into the airport parking lot at 3:15 and ran to the terminal as fast as I could. I looked down at the photograph in my hand, the one Alma had sent me 2 months earlier, smudged now from too much handling. Then I looked up, and the picture came to life. An African woman emerging from behind the customs gate, moving with easy, graceful steps, her bright, searching eyes now fixed on my own, her dark, round, sculpted face blossoming like a wood rose as she smiled. Barak! Alma! I lifted my sister off the ground as we embraced, and we laughed and laughed as we looked at each other. I picked up her bag and we began to walk to the parking garage, and she slipped her arm through mine. And I knew at that moment, somehow, that I loved her, so naturally, so easily and fiercely, that later, after she was gone, I would find myself mistrusting that love, trying to explain it to myself. "So, brother," Alma said as we drove into the city, "you have to tell me everything." I told her about Chicago and New York, my work as an organizer, my mother and grandparents and my other sister Maya. She had heard so much about them from our father, she said. She felt as if she already knew them. She described Heidelberg, where she was trying to finish a master's degree in linguistics, and the trials and tribulations of living in Germany. "I have no right to complain, I suppose," she said. "I have a scholarship, a flat. I don't know what I would be doing if I was still in Kenya. Still, I don't care for Germany so much. You know, the Germans like to think of themselves as very liberal when it comes to Africans. But if you scratch the surface, you see they still have the attitudes of their childhood. In German fairy tales, black people are always the goblins. Such things one doesn't forget so easily. Sometimes I try to imagine what it must have been like for the old man, leaving home for the first time." Alma and I spent the day together, visiting the Art Institute, digging old photos out of my closet, and visiting the supermarket. We didn't speak much about our father, though. It was as if our conversation stopped whenever we threatened to skirt his memory. It was only that night, after dinner and a long walk along the lake's crumbling breakwall, that we both sensed we couldn't go any further until we opened up the subject. I made us some tea, and Alma began to tell me about the old man, at least what she could remember. "I can't say I really knew him, Barak," she began. "Maybe nobody did. Not really. His life was so scattered. People only knew scraps and pieces, even his own children. I was scared of him. You know, he was already away when I was born, in Hawaii, with your mum, and then at Harvard. When he came back to Kenya, our oldest brother, Roy, and I were small children. We had lived with our mum in the country, in Alego up until then. I just remember that he came back with an American woman, named Ruth, and that he took us from our mother to go live with them in Nairobi. I remember that this woman, Ruth, was the first white person I'd ever been near, and that suddenly she was supposed to be my new mum. In those first years, the old man was doing really well, you see. He was working for an American oil company, Shell Oil, I think. It was only a few years after independence, and the old man was well connected with all the top government people. The vice president, ministers, they would all come to the house sometimes and drink with him and talk about politics. He had a big house and a big car, and everybody was impressed with him because he was so young, but he already had so much education from abroad. Ruth, our new mother, was nice enough to us then. She treated us almost like her own children. Then things began to change. When Ruth gave birth to our other brothers, Mark and David, her attention shifted to them. The old man, he left the American company to work in the government, for the Ministry of Tourism. He may have had political ambitions, and at first he was doing well in the government. But in 1966 or 67, the divisions in Kenya had become more serious. President Kenyatta was from the largest tribe, the Kikuyus. The Luos, the second largest tribe, began to complain that Kikuyus were getting all the best jobs. The vice president, Ondinga, was a Luo, and he said the government was becoming corrupt. Then instead of serving those who had fought for independence, Kenyan politicians had taken the place of the white colonials, buying up businesses and lands that should be redistributed to all the people. A popular Luo minister, Tom Mamboya, was killed by a Kikuyu gunman. Luos began to protest in the streets, and the government police cracked down. People were killed. Most of the old man's friends just kept quiet and learned to live with the situation. But the old man began to speak up. He would tell people that tribalism was going to ruin the country, and that unqualified men were taking the best jobs. His friends tried to warn him about saying such things in public, but he didn't care. He always thought he knew what was best, you see. When he was passed up for a promotion, he complained loudly. Word got back to Kenyatta that the old man was a troublemaker, and he was called in to see the president. According to the stories, Kenyatta said to the old man that because he could not keep his mouth shut, he would not work again until he had no shoes on his feet. I don't know how much of these details are true, but I know that with the president as an enemy, things became very bad for the old man. He was banished from government, blacklisted. None of the ministers would give him work. Finally, he had to accept a small job with the water department. The job kept food on the table, but it was a big fall for him. The old man began to drink heavily, and many of the people he knew stopped coming to visit because now it was dangerous to be seen with him. I understood most of this only when I was older. At the time, I just saw that life at home became very difficult. The old man never spoke to Roy or myself except to scold us. He would come home very late, drunk, and we could hear him shouting at Ruth, telling her to cook him food. Roy and I began to feel like we had no one. And when Ruth left the old man, that feeling was not so far from the truth. Ruth left when I was 12 or 13, after the old man had a serious car accident. For a long time, the old man was in the hospital, almost a year, and Roy and I basically lived on our own. Because of the accident, the old man had now lost his job at the water department, and we had no place to live. Then we found a rundown house in a rough section of town, and we stayed there for several years. That was a terrible time. The old man had so little money, he would have to borrow from relatives just for food. This made him more ashamed, I think, and his temper got worse. Despite all our troubles, he would never admit to Roy or myself that anything was wrong. I think that's what hurt the most, the way he would still put on airs about how we were the children of Dr. Obama. Roy and him would have terrific fights. Finally, Roy just left. He just stopped coming home and started living with different people. So I was left alone with the old man. Sometimes I would stay up half the night, waiting to hear him come through the door, worrying that something terrible had happened. Then he would stagger in drunk and come into my room and wake me because he wanted company or something to eat. He would talk about how unhappy he was and how he had been betrayed. Secretly, I began to wish that he would just stay out one night and never come back. In my last 2 years of high school, the old man's situation improved. Kenyatta died, and somehow the old man was able to work again in government. He got a job with the Ministry of Finance and started to have money again and influence. But I think he never got over the bitterness of what had happened to him, seeing his other age mates, who had been more politically astute, rise ahead of him, and it was too late to pick up the pieces of his family. For a long time he lived alone, in a hotel room, even when he could afford again to buy a house. I almost never saw him, and when I did, he didn't know how to behave with me. We were like strangers. But he still wanted to pretend that he was a model father and could tell me how to behave. I remember when I got my scholarship to study in Germany, I was afraid to tell him. I thought he might say I was too young to go and interfere with my student visa, which had to be approved by the government. So I just left without saying goodbye. For some time, Alma had been staring at our father's photograph, soft-focused in the dim light. Now she stood up and went to the window, her back turned to me. The old man used to talk about you so much, Alma said. He would show off your picture to everybody and tell us how well you were doing in school. I guess your mom and him used to exchange letters. I think those letters really comforted him. During the really bad times, when everybody seemed to have turned against him, he would bring her letters into my room and start reading them out loud. He would wake me up and make me listen, and when he was finished, he would shake the letter in his hand and say how kind your mom had been. You see, he would say, at least there are people who truly care for me. He'd say this to himself over and over again. While Alma brushed her teeth, I prepared the convertible sofa for her. Soon she was curled up under a blanket, sound asleep. But I remained awake, propped up in a chair with the desk light on, looking at the stillness of her face, listening to the rhythm of her breathing, trying to make some sense out of all that she had said. I felt as if my world had been turned on its head, as if I had woken up to find a blue sun in a yellow sky, or heard animals speaking like men. All my life I had carried a single image of my father, one that I had sometimes rebelled against, but had never questioned, one that I had later tried to take as my own. The brilliant scholar, the generous friend, the upstanding leader. My father had been all those things. Now, as I sat in the glow of a single light bulb, rocking slightly on a hard-backed chair, that image had suddenly vanished, replaced by, what? A bitter drunk? A defeated, lonely bureaucrat? To think that all my life I had been wrestling with nothing more than a ghost. For a moment I felt giddy. If Alma hadn't been in the room, I probably would have laughed out loud. The king is overthrown, I thought. The emerald curtain is pulled aside. The rabble in my head is free to run riot. I can do whatever I damn well please. For what man, if not my own father, has the power to tell me otherwise? Whatever I do, it seems, I won't do much worse than he did. As the night wore on, I tried to regain my balance, sensing that there was little satisfaction to be had from my newfound liberation. The fantasy of my father, had at least kept me from despair. Now he was dead. Truly. He could no longer tell me how to live. All he could tell me, perhaps, was what had happened to him. It occurred to me that for all the new information, I still didn't know the man my father had been. What had happened to all his vigor, his promise? What had shaped his ambitions? I imagined once again the first and only time we'd met. The man I now knew must have been as apprehensive as I was. The man who had returned to Hawaii to sift through his past and perhaps try and reclaim that best part of him, that part that had been misplaced. He hadn't been able to tell me his true feelings then, any more than I had been able to express my 10-year-old desires. We had been frozen by the sight of the other, unable to escape the suspicion that under examination, our true selves would be found wanting. Now, 15 years later, I looked into Alma's sleeping face and saw the price we had paid for that silence. 10 days later, Alma and I sat in the hard plastic seats of an airport terminal, looking out at the planes through a high wall of glass. I asked her what she was thinking about, and she smiled softly. "I was thinking about a Lego," she said. "Home Square. Our grandfather's land, where Granny still lives. It's the most beautiful place, Barak. When I'm in Germany, and it's cold outside, and I'm feeling lonely, I sometimes close my eyes and imagine I'm there, sitting in the compound, surrounded by big trees that our grandfather planted. Granny is talking, telling me something funny, and I can hear the cow swishing its tail behind us, and the chickens pecking at the edges of the field, and the smell of the fire from the cooking hut. And under the mango tree, near the cornfields, is the place where the old man is buried." Alma's flight was starting to board. We remained seated, and Alma closed her eyes, squeezing my hand. "We need to go home," she said. "We need to go home, Barak, and see him there." Johnny Owens and I were walking back to the car after dinner in Hyde Park, and Johnny was in an expansive mood. He often got like this, especially after a good meal and wine. The first time I met him, when he was still working with the Downtown Civic Group, he had started to explain the relationship between jazz and Eastern religion, then swerved into an analysis of black women's behinds, before coming to a stop on the subject of Federal Reserve Bank policy. In such moments, Johnny's eyes would grow wide, his voice would speed up, his round, bearded face would glow with a childlike wonder. That was part of the reason I'd hired Johnny, I suppose, that curiosity of his appreciation of the absurd. He was a philosopher of the blues. We'd almost reached Johnny's car when we heard a small pop, compact and brief, like a balloon bursting. We looked in the direction of the sound and watched a young man appear from around the corner diagonal to us. I don't clearly recall his features or what he wore, although he couldn't have been older than 15. I just remember that he ran at a desperate pace, his sneakered feet silent against the sidewalk, his lanky limbs pumping wildly, his chest jutting out as if straining for an imaginary tape. Johnny dropped flat onto a small plot of grass in front of one of the apartments, and I quickly followed suit. A few seconds later, 2 more boys came around the same corner, also running at full speed. One of them, short, fattish, with pants that bunched around his ankles, was waving a small pistol. Without stopping to aim, he let out 3 quick shots in the direction of the first boy. Then, realizing that his target was out of range, he slowed to a walk, stuffing the weapon under his shirt. His companion, skinny and big-eared, came alongside. "Stupid motherfucker," the skinny boy said. He spat with satisfaction, and the 2 of them laughed to each other before continuing down the street. Children again, their figures casting squat shadows on the asphalt. I had been in Chicago for over 2 years by this time. The organization had grown, and I had grown with it. Marty had moved on, deciding to try his hand working in a less hostile atmosphere. Working on my own, I had recruited new churches, found new leaders, helped to build new playgrounds and remove asbestos from a local housing project, and expand our job training efforts. Johnny's presence as my deputy had helped relieve my workload, and our budget was stable. What I'd lost in youthful enthusiasm, I made up for in experience. And in fact, it may have been that growing familiarity with the landscape, the counsel of time, that gave me the sense that something different was going on with the children of the South Side that spring of 1987. That a line had been crossed, a blind and ugly corner turned. There was nothing definite I could point to, no hard statistics. The drive-by shootings, the ambulance sirens, the night sounds of neighborhoods abandoned to drugs and gang war, and phantom automobiles, where police or press rarely ventured until after the body was found on the pavement, blood spreading in a glistening, uneven pool. None of this was new. In the housing projects, prison records had been passed down from father to son for more than a generation. During my very first days in Chicago, I had seen the knots of young men, 15 or 16, hanging out on the corners of Michigan or Halsted, their hoods up, their sneakers unlaced, stomping the ground in a desultory rhythm during the colder months, stripped down to T-shirts in the summer, answering their beepers on the corner payphones, a knot that unraveled, soon to reform, whenever the police cars passed by in their barracuda silence. No, it was more of a change of atmosphere, like the electricity of an approaching storm. I felt it when, driving home one evening, I saw 4 tall boys walking down a tree-lined block, idly snapping a row of young saplings that an older couple had just finished planting in front of their house. I felt it whenever I looked into the eyes of the young men in wheelchairs who had started appearing on the streets that spring, boys crippled before their prime, their eyes without a trace of self-pity, eyes so composed, already so hardened, that they served to frighten rather than to inspire. That's what was new, the arrival of a new equilibrium between hope and fear, the sense, shared by adults and youth alike, that some, if not most of our boys, were slipping beyond rescue. Even lifelong Southsiders, like Johnny, noticed the change. "I ain't never seen it like this, Barack," he would tell me one day as we sat in his apartment sipping beer. "I mean, things were tough when I was coming up, but there were limits. We get high, get into fights, but out in public, at home, if an adult saw you getting loud or wild, they'd say something, and most of us would listen. You know what I'm saying? Now, with the drugs, the guns, all that's disappeared. Don't take a whole lot of kids carrying a gun, just 1 or 2. Somebody says something to one of them, and pow, kid wastes them. Folks hear stories like that, they just stop trying to talk to young cats out here. We start generalizing about them, just like the white folks do. We see them hanging out, we head the other way. After a while, even the good kid starts realizing, ain't nobody out here going to look out for him. So he figures he's going to have to look out for himself. Bottom line, you've got 12-year-olds making their own damn rules." Johnny took another sip of his beer. "I don't know, Barack. Sometimes I'm afraid of them. You've got to be afraid of